So this morning I wanted to engage in some serious polemics, argumentation to combat um, some racism that is nothing new, unfortunately. So, but often when you see Jews or Israel mentioned, like for example on YouTube, you'll see commenters who will use this term, the Synagogue of Satan, and they're using it to refer to Jewry or the Jewish people throughout the world. Um, and they get it from Revelation chapter 2 verse 9. So this is really serious. If the person is an atheist, then there's not much you can, you know, say to them to you would have to come at them from like secular reasoning to awaken in their minds why racism is evil, or at least morally reprehensible. Maybe the atheist doesn't even believe in such thing as good or evil. Heck, a lot of atheists don't even believe in such a thing as morals. Um, so I'm really speaking to the people who use these verses because they really do sincerely believe in their Christian scriptures, in their so-called New Testament. And I'm also speaking to Jews who might be victims of this racism, this anti-Jewish propaganda, at least the way these verses are used. So, in Revelation chapter 2 verse 9, it says in the Revised Standard Version, I know your tribulation or your troubles and your poverty, although you are rich, and the slander of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. So if we read this literally, then these would be Gentiles who are passing themselves off as Jews, just like Pauline Christians claim to be grafted into Israel just by believing in Jesus, where we know that that's not a, a bona fide, genuine conversion to Judaism according to Jewish law. But they use this term Synagogue of Satan to embrace Jews as a whole. And I guess it must be because in Revelation chapter 3 verse 9 it uses the term again, but it's referring to those in a different location, a different city. So it doesn't seem to be speaking to a specific synagogue. I think in the first place it was Smyrna, and then in the second place it was in Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. Yeah, just not for Jews, right? So the reason this is serious is because if you really are a Bible believer, by cursing Israel, you could be cutting yourself off from blessing. Because as we see in Genesis chapter 12, the Creator said to Avram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation. Now this is speaking of Israel. And I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. This is a promise that he gives. Basically, we would call it a prophecy if it was given by the Creator through a human being's mouth. But this apparently is the Creator speaking directly to Avram. So when he makes a promise, that's just what's going to happen, you know. So I'll make of you a great nation, and that's Israel. I will bless those who bless you, and there it seems like he's saying that he will bless those who bless Avram individually and specifically. But that's not kind of not how Scripture works. Like when, for example, the name Jacob is used after Jacob has died, it speaks of Jacob's descendants, his fleshly descendants. When the name Israel is used after Israel has died, the original man named Israel has died, then it's speaking of his fleshly descendants. And I'm sure also, converts who have intermarried with fleshly Israel and whose children have become fleshly Israel through the intermarriage following conversion, which at that point it's not even intermarriage anymore, because according to the halacha of Jewish law, they're considered Israel at that point. They're considered Jews. So if you're heaping racist curses upon the children of Israel, you could be cutting yourself off. I say could because I'm not going to tell the Creator what to do, but he says it pretty explicitly here that he will curse those who curse Israel. But if you bless Israel, he will bless you. And then he says that by Israel all the families of the earth shall bless themselves. So it's through Israel that the families of the earth can bless themselves. So this is why it's a very serious thing to be racist towards the Jewish people. Just from a self-interest perspective, because you could be cutting yourself off from the blessings of heaven. So, this term, Synagogue of Satan, let's get into the content of Revelation chapter 2, verse 9. This accusation that these people say they are Jews and are not, and how it's twisted into referring to those that everyone knows to be the Jewish people, right? Everyone accepts them to be the Jewish people, except for these racists. Now, not just everyone living, right? But the Christian scriptures nowhere say that those who are called Jews in the Christian scriptures aren't actually Jews, that they're actually Gentiles posing as Jews. So to assert that this is referring to the actual Jewish people is incongruous with the rest of the Christian scriptures. Now, as for the content of the rest of this, these Christian racists, I have to assume they're Christians if they're honestly using the book of Revelation as a proof text, then I have to call them Christians, because no one else does that, unless you're just like a racist trying to stir crap. So these Christians, they consider themselves such experts on who Revelation chapter 2 verse 9 is talking about. But then if we click on this passage and go to the chapter, if we go to Revelation chapter 2 verse 2, they have no idea who this is talking about. And that's what gets me, is about people who use the book of Revelation for proof texting, is that it's kind of hilarious to me that Christians don't even know what their own book means. Like, this book is deeply shrouded in darkness for most Christians, yet they're going to use specific passages from it to proof text against another people. And it's these same people who think that they know what the Hebrew Tanakh, not these Gentile Christian Greek scriptures, mean, but then they also think that they know what the Hebrew Tanakh means better than the Jewish people who can read it in its original language. So they're experts in Revelation chapter 2 verse 9, but they're completely clueless when it comes to Revelation chapter 2 verse 2. They can't even venture the foggiest guess as to who this is talking about. Usually they will apply this in a pesherist sense, the same way I guess they're applying Revelation chapter 2 verse 9 in this pesherist sense of applying a verse that's talking about somebody else way back then to people who exist now. That's what I mean when I say pesherist, and it's based on how Robert Eisenman refers to pesherist interpretation. I think also Barbara Thierine, and I'm guessing like lots of scholars who study the Dead Sea Scrolls, because the Dead Sea Scrolls use verses this way. They take a passage that's referring to an ancient context or an ancient people or person, and then they apply it to a modern context or a current context, at least for them, or a current people or a current person. And anybody that's read the Christian scriptures is familiar with this. I would say that anybody that's read the Mishnah or the Talmud is probably familiar with this, using old passages and making them more up to date, more current, applying them in a way that makes them more in line with current affairs, right? So, like, everybody does it, so you can't really fault anybody for doing it, you know. Except that if you apply it in a modern way that is contradictory to the original application or meaning, right? For example, if the passage was originally pro-Torah, for the obedience and observance of commandments of the law of Moses, and then you use that same passage in a modern sense to twist it into an anti-Torah or lawless way, then you're being insincere. And Paul does this frequently in his epistles. So, back to Revelation chapter 2 verse 2. These guys, they have no clue who this could be talking about, Revelation chapter 2 verse 2. Even though the Christian scriptures give hints all throughout about who this might be talking about. Who is this person who calls himself an apostle but is not? And it says that it's multiple people, evil men, right? So we could start with a name that's very obvious to anyone looking, because the tendency is to see this verse in a pesherist sense and to apply it to the preacher down the street at the other church, and to say that he's a false apostle, right? Because you're trying to bring people into the pews of your church, so you're going to call the other preacher a false apostle while you're a true apostle, right? That's how it's usually applied. No one ever really tries to figure out who is being referred to historically in its proper context. Again, even though the Christian scriptures give you hints all throughout. Now, there was a group called the Ebionites, and they were considered by the rising Christian orthodoxy to be heretics, because they were considered just this sect, kind of like the Netzarim or Nazarenes, who had beliefs and practices that didn't align with typical Christian orthodoxy at the time, Gentile Christian orthodoxy, because it certainly wasn't supposedly Hebraic Christian orthodoxy. Because if there ever was a Jerusalem church, it very quickly became a thing of the past and just a relic of Christian history, and certainly not something that anybody in Gentile Christianity was trying to imitate. Apologies for the phone in the background. So, so let's see, where was I? So, anyway, these Ebionites, these Evyonim, they were accused of various things that made them that they were considered heretics for. One was they didn't believe, they had poor thoughts about Christ, they're saying. And that's that's one joke that they make about the Evyonim, because Evyonim means the poor ones, or Ebionites means the poor ones in Hebrew. So one joke that they make is that they had poor thoughts about Christ, meaning that they didn't believe that Jesus was God. They also believed in keeping the commandments of the Torah, which is completely in harmony with the whole Hebrew Tanakh. They didn't believe that Paul was a true apostle, and they also had a version of the Gospel of Matthew that didn't have any virgin birth narrative in it. I'm going off the top of my head. These are the accusations as I remember them. There may have been another one, or even more than that, but I think it was about that many. But there are fundamental differences. Making them different than Pauline Christianity. So, I once had a gentleman challenge me to prove that the Ebionites actually conformed to those accusations. Well, in the Catholic Encyclopedia, it says that the Ebionites got their name from their leader, Ebion. Now, knowing a little Hebrew, I laughed out loud when I read that, because it seemed so ignorant. Because I knew that the term in Hebrew meant poor ones. Well, when I read in James the Brother of Jesus by Robert Eisenman that the Dead Sea Scrolls community had a leader named the Evion, the poor one, and that the community itself was sometimes referred to as the Evionim, I bought a Hebrew concordance of the Dead Sea Scrolls and I verified it for myself. Of course, I didn't have a Hebrew text of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Instead, I would follow the references in the concordance to the English translation and see how it was translated in English, verifying that that's what was said in the Hebrew, at least through the English translation. So, without a doubt, the leader of this community, at least at one time, of the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls, their leader was referred to as, I believe, as Ha-Evion, meaning the Evion, the poor one, and the community was referred to as the Evionim, the poor ones. Now, I kind of wonder if this term in Hebrew and in Judaism, whether it might refer to the Levites, because they didn't have territorial holdings the same way the other tribes did. You know, they didn't, not as like one corporate body. But I don't know for certain, and I guess it's not important for this video. But the important thing about the Evionim, which we see knowing that they're mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and knowing that these Evionim in the Dead Sea Scrolls certainly did not believe that Jesus or Jesus was God. They certainly did believe in keeping the commandments of the Torah. They, as for their version of Matthew, you know, it would be expected that they wouldn't have a version that would have this pagan virgin birth narrative in it, but I kind of rather doubt that they even bought into any of the Jesus myth at all. And then what was the final thing? Well, they definitely didn't believe that Paul was a true apostle, because Paul, as we can see repeatedly throughout the Christian scriptures, teaches against the Torah. And that's why he's such a hero, even more than Jesus, amongst modern Christianity. Because Paul appears to teach against the commandments of the Torah. I think he actually does, but you get apologists trying to save Paul's reputation who will assert that no, he only appears to teach against the Torah. So the Evionim would not have seen Paul to be a true apostle, and there's even a text that asserts outright that I think the Evionim said that Paul was I think a Sadducee or something, or he aspired to something, wanted to marry the high priest's daughter or some business. I don't know, you'd have to look that up. It's not important right now. But the Dead Sea Scrolls community is nowhere touting Paul as their hero the way that the Gentile Christian church does. So they clearly did not believe that Paul was a true apostle. But these racists who are fond of using Revelation chapter 2 verse 9 and Revelation chapter 3 verse 9 as proof texts against the Jewish people, they have no clue who Revelation chapter 2 verse 2 might be talking about. Even though Paul is the prototypical false apostle, So, enough about that. So back to Revelation chapter 2, verse 9. We're going to look at the interlinear, and here that word used is Greek Strong's Concordance number 4864, synagogue. Now, in the King James Version, I'm using the Revised Standard Version, synagogue is translated, I mean, come on, people, it's phonetic. It's translated synagogue 55 times. Congregation only once, and that's because it's like Acts chapter 13, verse 43, I believe, and I don't know why they bothered to translate it congregation there. They could have translated it synagogue, because I think the verse right before it is translated synagogue, and it's talking about the same thing. But then it's translated assembly one time, and that is in that is in James chapter 2, verse 2. Now, James is supposed to be the brother of Jesus, like the fleshly brother of Jesus, and although I think some will say no, he's just the spiritual brother. I think Catholicism maybe tried to distance James' fleshly relationship to Jesus, allegedly, according to the mythology, because they didn't want to like humanize Jesus too much, I guess. I don't know. So, anyways, he's called James the brother of Jesus, but he's the leader of the Jerusalem church, right? So this is a Hebrew culture here. Hebraic. So in James chapter 2, verse 2, if we look at first of all, it starts out, my brothers, show no partiality as you hold the faith of our Yoshki. In other words, he's speaking to Christians here, or writing to Christians. For if a man with gold rings and in fine clothing comes into your assembly. So he's speaking of a Christian assembly here. However, the word used there is also synagogue. Now, why might the biased Christian translators have translated this that way? Well, I guess partly because maybe out of ignorance, maybe the idea of Christians in a synagogue was so shocking to them that they said, no, it can't possibly be translated synagogue in this passage. But I think there's something more sinister about how it was translated that way. Because in these 55 plus translations of synagogue as synagogue, a good portion of them are painting Jews in a negative light. So they're painting Jews and those who attend a synagogue or go to a synagogue in a negative light. So this is a different religious community at the time. These would be people who are not accepting the message about Jesus as the Messiah. So they are the other. They are the enemy. The Christian scriptures paints them in a negative light. But when it comes to James chapter 2, verse 2, suddenly it translates that term as assembly because it doesn't want Christians, even if it's the Jerusalem church, associated with the term synagogue. This is the dishonesty of Christian bias in translating their own scriptures. They certainly don't want Christians associated with the Synagogue of Satan in the book of Revelation. Otherwise, they might have to explain, well, there are good synagogues and there are bad synagogues, and our synagogues are good, but their synagogues are bad. This is evil. This is racism. This is dishonest scholarship in order to stigmatize and demonize the Jewish people. So next time you hear a racist using Revelation chapter 2 verse 9 as a proof text against the Jewish people, you might ask them, okay, so who is Revelation chapter 2 verse 2 talking about if you're such an expert? Or you might ask them, well, why is the same Greek word synagogue used in James chapter 2 verse 2 to refer to a Christian congregation? See what their answers are. I'd be interested to hear it. I seriously doubt any of them are educated enough in their own scriptures to be able to answer your questions.